Being a chief of police in any size town is not an easy task. Between leading your officers, answering to city officials, and of course answering to the public, it's a balancing act worthy of the Walendas. Well, here in Columbia, the police department's been around for 158 years, and in that time, 32 men have worn the Gold Chief's badge, serving tenures ranging from 3 months to 3 decades. It does pose a question. Is the top cop spot tenure here in Columbia average, or is it more of a revolving door?
Columbia, although founded in 1786, created its first official police force right around the time of the Civil War. And as different as life was in the South in that time frame, as were the men who were to police it.
You can't put 21st century values and standards on behavior in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
To that end, the first chief, or captain, as his actual rank read, was, by all accounts, rough around the edges, but did his best to hold the city together through the war. He had his struggles, including the riot where there was an uprising of USC students. But in the end, Chief John Burdell was a businessman and a slave owner prior to the war, and he had leased slaves to the city. So at the end of the war, he submitted a hefty bill.
It astounds me that given the shape that Columbia was in and the South in general, that right after the war, he was still in there demanding payment.
The city never paid. It created controversy, and ultimately Burdell left town, electing to put down stakes in Camden. There he became a man of the people and even funded the Kershaw Hospital. During the early days, the selection process for chief was something more of a political appointment rather than actual law enforcement aptitude.
Politics guided who was selected and who had the same beliefs and political belief systems as whoever was in former government at that time that would help them meet their agenda.
Many of them had never spent a day on as a policeman until they became chief.
Appointments in law enforcement were made for 1 year. So for the first 30 years of the city, the list of chiefs was long, including Daniels, Fickling, Nixon, Graham, and Radcliffe, who actually ended up serving 3 times.
Around 1890, the very first officer would rise up through the ranks to become the chief of police. Now, by all accounts, he was a good man and a good leader, but history has created some controversy.
He hired on as a policeman and came up through the ranks and was elected to be chief in 1890.
Higbee in later years had regaled his grandson of the stories of serving in the Confederacy, being wounded, and the great acts of heroism that he had done. And therein lies the controversy.
About 1870, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and actually was sent to South Carolina as part of the occupation troops during Reconstruction.
It wasn't until much later, in fact after his death, and most recently, that historians would discover pay information that would tell the real tale. Then came the story of the legitimate Confederate veteran Owen Daly, who had risen to the status of local hero after a run-in with some Yankees at a bar.
He and a friend accosted some northern journalists in a bar. Apparently they were already somewhat under the influence of alcohol, and a bar fight ensued.
Well, his local notoriety may have gotten him the job, but there was still one burning question. How old was he? Really?
He's older than he claims to be, it appears. He probably approached his 90s.
According to his headstone, he was 90 when he died. That means he was still working as a police officer in his late 80s.
Well, despite the fact that he was in the big house and was perhaps a little loosey-goosey with chronological time, he served until 1907. That was when his second-in-command, William Cathcart, essentially swapped places with him.
Cathcart, whose father at the time was Sheriff Cathcart, was elevated to the rank of sergeant. He stayed in that position for several months, and then he was made chief of police.
For his knowledge, as a favor, or some other reason, Daly was allowed to remain on the department for several years. But the days of horse-swapping for the leadership role in Columbia was coming to an end. Sort of.
As the city blasted into the 20th century, a new world was emerging, and with it, the way we policed. But even with a new generation of cops, trouble at the top continued.
Over the first 70 years or so, Columbia saw many changes, from rebuilding after the Civil War to expansion in population and business, which of course required the Columbia Police Department to expand too. But size wasn't the only change. By 1914, 12 men had served the city as chief, or captain, as their rank dictated, Many were selected for the 2-year term more by politics than skill as a policeman.
There was grumbling that the world is changing and they're wanting a little more professional behavior from the police department.
An early version of the civil service was created, which also impacted the tenure of the top cop.
At the time, they went on the philosophy that once you're elected chief, it's for life.
And therein lay the next bout of drama inside headquarters. In 1914, John Richardson was made chief of the department, which continued to grow along with the time. During his tenure, the selection process changed again and began to model the more modern civil service process we see today. And for reasons historians still ponder, the winds of change continued to blow in the city, and it turned out that for life was just a bit too long.
But then at some point, for some reason, there was a desire to get rid of him.
In 1921, Richardson was replaced by an officer he'd worked the streets with, Frederick Strickland, which set the stage in court for a battle over the gold badge.
There is a lawsuit that is filed by him because he is told that he will be police chief for life, when in fact, he is not police chief for life.
His argument was time-honored, but not favorably looked upon by the court.
I was in place, basically grandfathered me in, and the judge and the court system said no.
Strickland went on to serve for about 9 years as chief.
By 1940, the bugs in the civil service system had been worked out, for the most part. It also marked the beginning of the tenure of the longest-serving chief of police in Columbia, Chief Lyle Campbell.
Campbell was the longest-serving police chief that we've had, and he also came up through the ranks.
Chief Campbell, in his day and even in history, is seen as an effective leader and policeman.
Not a lot of controversy that really surrounds him.
Former State Senator Jake Knotts has fond memories of the man who would ultimately start his life in public service.
Chief Campbell was the chief. He was the chief as long as I could remember. He told me one time, says, boy, you grow up, keep your nose clean, I'll make a police out of you.
Well, Chief Campbell was good to his word, and when the would-be senator came back to Columbia, he went knocking on the doors of headquarters. And the rest, as they say, is history. History tells us that Chief Campbell put the department on the map, winning awards and setting standards as a professional police agency.
The city won awards for safe pedestrians, safe crime, safe vehicle.
But the chief wasn't all about shining his medals. He also changed the way police officers were trained.
The only training you had was on-the-job training, and with looking at senior officers.
They'd put you with someone for a couple of weeks on a beat and send you away. And sometimes they didn't do that. They didn't give you a gun. You just said go. He was responsible for basically modernizing us to where we are today, as far as having what we have and having the training that we have and pushing for it.
It didn't take long, however, after Campbell's retirement in 1971, for Chief William Cawthon to undo 3 decades of work.
Mishandling evidence and giving out guns that weren't registered. Cawthon took a big bulk of the heat, even though there was a captain of investigations that was fired and some other investigators underneath there.
Although never directly blamed, questions of missing evidence, property, and even guns among his subordinates sullied the shiny reputation of the CPD. And in 1978, Chief Cawthon stepped aside.
But not even all the controversy, poor decision-making, or even questionable backgrounds together could add up to the chief that was convicted of bribery, faked his own death, and was apprehended at the Magic Kingdom. Over the last century and a half, 32 men have put on the gold shield and led the Columbia Police Department. Questions, controversy, and even convictions have plagued the top cop.
Over 3 decades, Chief Lyle Campbell created a force that would rival any in the country, implementing training standards, community police efforts, and continuing education for officers. All this amidst the changes in the country through the 1950s and 60s. But within 10 years of his departure, controversy had once again made its way to the police chief's office. In 1978, William Cawthon stepped down after allegations of wrongdoing by officers came to light. The city then decided to cast a nationwide search for the best of the best to lead the department.
So they went outside and went to somewhere up in next to Chicago, and got this guy, Arthur Hess, which nobody knew about.
Arthur Hess, who had 19 years of police service under his belt, was seen as the savior to clean up the department's tarnished reputation. It was, however, just 2 short years later when that top cop was in the headlines, and not for stopping crime. Former Columbia Police Detective Jake Knotts was an investigator for the solicitor's office when he became aware that Hess may be involved in criminal activity. Nightclub owner Joel Hendricks told Knotts that Hess had interesting hoops to jump through in order to obtain a liquor license in the city.
He was going to assess him on his liquor license in the different bars and stuff like that, and he felt like he was trying to bribe him.
But the relationship between Hess and Hendricks may have gone a little deeper.
Hess was taking bribes.
You see, it turned out that Hendricks was paying the chief to tip him off before a raid on his gambling establishments. Hess was set up by investigators who caught him taking money from Hendricks, and he's charged criminally.
It wasn't very long that he was going to have to serve in time with good behavior. He probably served maybe 2.5 months. Well, that, I think, was too much for him.
And here is where the story gets even more complex. So Hess, who's married, and his girlfriend, who's married, come up with a plan.
So they parked their vehicle, pour some type of animal blood in the car to make it appear as if they had been killed. And of course, it didn't work that well.
Obviously, Hess wasn't dead. In fact, when he was ultimately caught, he was found at the happiest place on earth by an off-duty cop from South Carolina.
He was visiting down in Disneyland, and there's Alpha Hess walking around Disneyland, and they arrested him and brought him back.
The very much alive Hess was returned to the state where he served his sentence.
It's something that Hollywood would probably do, not a chief of police.
So the city, once again with something of a black eye, decided to look internally for its next leader.
Chief Austin had been the assistant. He became the chief and was there for 10 years and did an outstanding job with that.
After Chief Austin's tenure, the next permanent chief named was Dean Crisp in 2004.
Dean Crisp was a very honorable, decent, very good police chief.
Crisp was popular with his officers because he gave them an ear, forming advisory groups to help shape the future of the department internally. But in the end, the Gold Shield again acted more like a target than a symbol of justice for Chief Crisp.
It's known as CPD's cheating scandal.
A new self-training system was implemented based on the honor system.
And they found out that this officer happened to have the test open when another officer walked in.
Interestingly, it was the chief's quick response in letting some 20 officers go that raised eyebrows and didn't sit well. And soon after, he was in the headlines again.
With a triple homicide that makes national news and invites people into a crime scene that shouldn't have been there.
But that wasn't the only time that Crisp had non-police personnel at a crime scene.
I think going to a crime scene with his son, which I never thought that was any type of scandal.
Crisp and the city ultimately decided to part ways, which would set the stage for the shortest chief's tenure in department history. Tomorrow we take a look at Harold Reeves, Randy Scott, and the interim chief hoping to stop the revolving door. After Arthur Hess was charged with misconduct in office, only to fake his own death to avoid jail, and a stand-up chief falling to several questionable choices, the city appointed interim chief Harold Reeves, who almost immediately tried to reverse the dismissals of some 20 police officers caught up in a cheating scandal. This move also proved to be unpopular, and Reeves served less than 2 months as interim chief. Chief Caldwell followed, then came Tandy Carter, who once again, by all accounts, was a good chief, a good leader, and a decorated soldier.
Very honorable, very honest person who did not, bend to any type of political anything.
But it may have been his solid character that would be his undoing. In the early hours of April 21, 2010, Mayor Steve Benjamin, just hours after his election party, was involved in an accident while on his way to an interview, which left a local waitress severely injured. Since the accident happened on Assembly Street, within the city, Carter was steadfast in who should investigate the crash.
People said they can handle it. I trust my people, so my people are going to investigate the accident.
Chief Carter did not see, and I talked to him about it, that in this case, a very unique case, having independent investigation was something everyone wanted to see happen. And I think he just did not see that.
This didn't sit well with some in the city, or even the state for that matter. The chief was told that an outside agency should investigate the wreck, since technically the new mayor was something of a boss to the chief. He continued to push back on any outsider looking into his investigation, and on May 10, 2010, Chief Carter left the city. The South Carolina Criminal Justice Training Academy requires that police officers get annual training. It includes learning new laws, brushing up on the old ones, and of course, shooting and proficiency with your firearm. If you fail to meet these standards, it can result in decertification. Until another permanent chief could be found, Carl Burke was appointed chief. It came to light, however, that he had not qualified with his firearm for the last 3 years, leaving his police certification expired. Burke finished his service to the city without a gun and in plain clothes. In October of 2010, former Richland County Chief Deputy Randy Scott was tapped to head the department. Scott had served the community for many years. He was knowledgeable with the city, its leaders, and residents. Scott was also very accessible to his officers, the community, and even the media. But even under Scott, several issues made headlines, including the botched investigation into the suicide of Thomas Sponseller. In December of 2012, Chief Scott announced that he was stepping down, temporarily anyway, because of rules surrounding police retirement. On December 31st, he resigned, but returned to his post 15 days later. In April 2013, Scott asked the city for an indefinite leave of absence, citing personal reasons. The leave was granted, followed by his stepping down permanently, effective May 1st.
They call it PTSD. You can call it stress.
Deputy Chief Ruben Santiago stepped into the interim role at CPD as a national search was conducted for the next chief. And Santiago made no bones about the fact that he wanted the permanent position and set about working to right the CPD ship. His efforts included a reduction in violent crime in many areas of the city. However, criminal activity in places like the Five Points District were still a bit of a thorn in his side. In 2010, when Scott joined the CPD, Santiago and David Navarro also made the move from the county to the city. During Scott's leadership, the three men worked closely on police department initiatives. But on July 12, 2013, Navarro was discharged from the city, which cited violations of policy, including recording private conversations. It was then that a major allegation was made.
And find out when they made a case with a stolen gun and some cocaine.
Santiago was quick to dismiss the existence of any nefarious plan, and even black ops.
We expect to be fully investigated, and since day one, I've invited those agencies to be a part of that investigation.
Lawsuits were filed by both parties, and SLED and federal investigations were initiated. The results of the investigation have not been released, and the national search has been cut down to 4 men, none of which is the current interim chief of the Columbia Police Department. But whoever it is will step onto the tight wire that is the Columbia chief's position. He'll have to continue to walk that line between his officers, the city, and its citizens. One thing is for certain, there are over 300 hardworking men and women who serve the citizens of Columbia, South Carolina. They need a leader and deserve stability, regardless of the man wearing the gold shield.